Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. In today's episode, we are joined by Nick Hewitt, a musician commonly known as ofsleepingbear. As you know, no mortal can outrun a redcap, so I hope you can sit back, listen, and enjoy. Nick is a talented composer who creates music for films, games, and more recently tabletop games. The track you hear in the background right now is from his Trials of the Dark Sun album, which is a really cool companion piece for anyone looking to run the Dark Sun setting. In this conversation, we talk about playing games, the role that music has in giving people a common thread to connect their experiences, defining the OSR, and so much more. You may hear the occasional audio glitch, as Nick was calling in from his phone, but those are few and far between. So please don't let that sway you from listening to this great chat. Okay, on to what you're really here for, the interview. All right, folks, we've got Nick Hewitt here, also known as Sleeping Bear, composer, musician, and also, strangely enough, or maybe not strangely, but uniquely enough, creates a lot of music directly targeted at gaming and modules in specific. Nick, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing fantastic. How about yourself?
Not too bad. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you got into making music for RPGs and why you started making music for RPGs as well.
By absolute accident. It's one of those things where I was trying to expand my portfolio, and I was really into like Dungeon Synth, and I got into the OSR through a lot of separate stuff that way. And I was like, well, I'm going to make an album, kind of about some of my like favorite older cliches. Um, it's semi-focused around second edition's Dark Sun setting, but also just like the sort of sword and sandal genre in and of itself. And that garnered a little bit more attention than I thought it would. um, when I shared it with OSR groups and D&D groups. And from there, I reached out to some other people and creators in those groups and ended up working with them for a couple other things. And here we are.
So often, whenever I think of music with regards to tabletop games, I'm usually thinking more of like ambient background stuff, like the typical chatter at a tavern or the spooky noise if I'm down in a dungeon type idea. But you also do a little bit more than just like an ambient noise. You have stuff that's more themed towards like actual modules or specific key moments and adventures and stuff, correct?
Yeah. It's a fine line to draw with that. And throughout this interview, you're going to hear me reference the fact that compared to writing for like a video game or a movie, tabletop RPGs are so interactive that your chaos factor of your players comes into play a lot. So when I'm writing music for an RPG module or a setting, I have to steer clear of things that are really, really specific because there are the odds that the players are going to pull a complete 180 and completely circumvent that. But I try to do my best to let the music be a tool that the game master can utilize to further, I guess, tickle the imaginations of their players. I try to make the music paint a picture just like their storytelling would.
Yeah, and I think that's true for the other forms of art that kind of goes into if you're making something for public consumption in the tabletop RPG space, you kind of have to really find that balance of being specific but also being as general as possible because you have no idea what once it hits the table where it's going to go. So you see that same caution being taken with people who are writing modules or people who are doing anything really in this hobby is like it doesn't survive first contact with the players most of the time if you've got a
Mhm.
very specific plan. Um, do you find with online play, do you find that music from the folks that get the most use out of your talents, out of the track stuff you use, is it more aimed for folks who are playing online or in person? Do you get any sort of feedback on which way that tends to go?
I've never gotten any feedback in terms of like which way it gets used more. Um, I've used music in my own like dungeon master stuff in person a lot, and it never gets any negative feedback. Online, I think it would be even more useful in that sense. That connection between people isn't quite as dynamic, like you're not as in person, and kind of where like maybe a dungeon master can't be as has animated with their body or something. The music might be able to kind of push tensions and certain cues and stuff forward. Um, and I've noticed there are actually around the time I was getting into making music for RPGs, a lot of services were being offered for utilizing music and sounds and stuff, almost like giant fantasy soundboards for online play. So I think it's becoming a little bit more of a commonplace thing to have soundtracks and playlists.
Yeah, I've used them a long time ago when I used to play 5e. There was a few folks of us that would play on Roll 20, and we would play. We tried to bundle in more music and stuff at that point. And then I moved away from 5e, and now generally the only place where I would probably, if I'm using Foundry, I can easily put music into that. But I find that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to, with all the various tools, it's difficult to get folks to where they can, experience the game and not have 16 different windows or things they have to sign into to get going. That's why I think maybe in person might be a little bit easier if you just, the DM has a laptop off to the side, plays music, and can key off of it. But um, online, I maybe but I'm not aware of any really great tools for making sure that you keep everything smooth and in check on there. Do you know of anything like that people should check out?
Right off the top of my head, the first one that was going to come to mind for the music and stuff was actually Foundry. That was the big one I saw right before I got into like doing this stuff. Um, you can run certain instances of audio players and stuff directly through Discord. I think that's probably the most streamlined thing where the music kind of plays. It's like a bot that's part of your voice call that is playing
Right.
like a playlist. And you can kind of tweak it from there. That would be the most like instanced, not thousands of windows thing kind of I could think of. But I don't do a lot of online play myself. I live in a pretty rural area. Like I'm actually doing this call with you on my phone because my actual internet is like satellite based. So I do in-person play a lot more than I do online play.
Very good. The So when you're sitting down to create a set of tracks, you were saying that there's a fine line between being specific and being just ambient background noise type radio, or background sounds. I shouldn't say noise, but background sounds that are roughly on a theme. What where do you How do you draw like the inspiration for, like, say you were going to do a classic Strahd type campaign, or a Keep on the Borderlands or something along those? How do you pick out key items from a module or something like that to compose something out of for?
The first thing I typically do is if I run through a module or a game itself, I take a lot of inspiration directly from the lore of the game, and I look at how is this lore presented to the players chronologically. Like, what are the players going to know and experience at the beginning, versus at the end? And I kind of use those reveal points as my mile markers. So if the party is going to start in a tavern, I'm going to make a tavern song. I'm going to make music that would play in the background of the tavern. You can't screw that up. You're going to start here. The players can't change that. Um, and I look through modules and see like the most key points that are integral to the adventure, and just kind of write off of those. And I see where I'm at from there. And if I have a lot of space left, I'll fill in with just general music tracks, like a travel song, an adventuring sort of jaunty tune. Or if I know there's a lot of combat, I'll make sure to write a couple like fighting pieces. And those tracks are intentionally able to be kind of thrown around or looped by the game master. So they're more of like a utility song versus like a thematic song.
What has been of the ones that you've created, what has been the your favorite module that you've created tracks for, or is there a module that you're just dying to sit down and actually get the time to do as well?
I had a lot of fun doing the music for We Deal in Lead, which is a sort of dark fantasy Western role-playing game, made by Bioden's Beard RPG. It's kind of a Cairn hack. That was really fun just because I got to do crazy spaghetti Western guitar music with synthesizers, and it's something you don't really get to do all the time. As for modules I'd like to do, there's a lot of them. Um, I'd really like to take a crack at like making music for Troika because it's just so out there and weird.
Hmm.
I don't even know where I'd begin with that, but like that would be a really fun project to take on.
Yeah, if you're into the Gonzo and the weird as well, go through, if you've not looked at them before, some DCC modules as well. There's some crazy stuff that can happen in DCC, and like their
Mm,
magic system is just full of strange and kookiness, but also has a lot of traditional Dungeons and Dragons style
hmm
activities happening as well. But you get a lot of the fun Gonzo stuff in there at the same time.
I think Dolmen would be really fun to score too. That would be a fantastic setting to like do music for.
Oh, 100%. Gavin has done great work with Dolmenwood. The whimsical weird is kind of the best way to describe Dolmenwood, I think. It's slightly twisted fairy tale, but you can
Hmm
definitely go in awesome directions with that. I completely agree. I think that would be another fantastic area to go to. The when you're making music, I'm always interested in the tools that people use. So, are you an Adobe person, or what tool base do you use as you're sitting down to create?
so I, depending on what the project calls for, and I'll actually ask the person I'm working with their preferences. Um, I will use physical instruments. I play quite a lot of them, a lot of world folk instruments, toggle harpa and bouzouki, a lot of Indian instruments. And I'll also use VST plugins. I actually work with a DAW called Traction Waveform,
Okay.
and it has like a free version that's just fairly bare bones, comes with like a few plugins on its own, and then I just have amassed a collection of them over the years. And I'll try to do a blend of both. Um, but but if the person I'm working with specifically is like, I want this to be as organic and natural as possible, I will just strictly work with physical instruments.
And if you're trying to loop in some of like the ambient stuff, I've seen people for soundtracks for movies and stuff. I've watched like the equivalent of like a director's commentary thing, where folks will go off into weird spots and just hold a microphone up and record sounds in random locations and then remix them or sample them, to kind of get the effects that they're looking for. Do you do anything like that, or is it more you're using like stock sounds from different places and then mixing in with the work that you do?
I will use I haven't actually gotten the opportunity to go out and like record any kind of ambient sounds like that. It's something that I would like to do. Um Especially because I live kind of in like rural Michigan. It's not that far of a drive to go right out into nature and do stuff like that. And I've seen a lot of really interesting stuff come from that. Um the primary musician in Vordrona will actually go out with like a microphone and he'll beat out rhythms on tree trunks with sticks and then remix them later and do crazy things like that. But for myself, I'll find um, samples online that are random. Like I won't even really look for something specific. I'll just look for like a big package of just nature sounds or city sounds and I'll modify them and work with them. Just kind of like see what's in there and see what I can use. I kind of like to go about it that way, where it's kind of a random pick of what I might have and go from there.
Right. You have mentioned synths before. Do you do any like the modular synths? I'm stumbling with my words. Modular synths,
Yeah,
and some of the randomization that can do as well.
I would really like to. modular synths are a really big monetary investment. Um, and a lot of composers I follow utilize modular synthesis. Like they just have like their modules built around their workstation and just patch them in here and there. But a lot of what I do synth-wise is wavetable synthesis, which is really similar. It's like digital modules that are utilizing the primary sound is going through different waveforms, but the waveforms aren't just like two-dimensional, some of them are three-dimensional. And you can do crazy sound design stuff with that and make just absolutely insane um, cylindrical sounds and panning and stuff like that. And that's about as close as I get. But I would like to work with more modular hardware synths.
Yeah, you're completely correct on the price. I've looked at some of those before, and the pricing it almost seems ridiculous. I guess it's because it's such a niche thing. I've played around with I think it's a VCV rack. It's
Mhm.
a software based version. They have a lot of the same modules that you could buy in physical form, and they kind of emulate them or replicate them completely digitally. And I have all the musical talent of a toad. Like it's just, in fact, no, toads can sing better than I can. A mute person is about as much musical talent as I have. A mute deaf person. So, but I do find it fun going through it and messing with it and just seeing some of the crazy random stuff that can come out of it. And um, I haven't tried. My son plays piano and he's got the digital piano here. I've never tried hooking it up to the MIDI interface, but now as I was just thinking about it, that'd be something interesting to try too. But yeah, I think it'd be really cool to combine a lot of the digital tools as well as kind of what you were saying there earlier with the going out into nature and just hammering on a tree and seeing how that sounds and then messing with it. I think there'd be a lot of really neat things you could do with that.
Yep, and I do try to blend. I guess my philosophy with like fantasy music in particular is I try to keep like mundane songs mundane, like physical instruments or just stock strings and drums and percussion. But the moment things start to get out of the mundus and into like the arcane or the eldritch, I will start breaking out like synthesizers and try to, give that feeling that this is different and otherworldly. I want stuff that's magical to sound magical. And a lute doesn't sound magical, but a big oscillating synthesizer is going to sound different enough to players that they kind of think, okay, something's going on here with this particular instance.
Yeah, your brain's trying to find that pattern and it just isn't coming because it keeps changing all the time. The I guess the other thing there as well is, I mean, especially with D&D, there's been a long history of combining science fiction with fantasy, and so you can really play into some of that stuff as well.
Mhm.
What's the so you mentioned earlier that you kind of found the OSR a little bit just by going through through the music and doing some side projects. What is the OSR to you? Like, how do you view the OSR or old school gaming? Uh,
I
what's this when those three letters get said? It's a different definition for almost every person. But what would it be for you?
Mhm.
No idea.
For me, it's not even just like specifically tabletop gaming. It's the growth of role-playing games into an entire world practically. I don't just look at the OSR as old D&D and its offshoots. I look at it as the beginning of computer RPGs. I look at it as beginnings of roguelike games. I look at it as B-movie fantasy and sci-fi film and the music that came with a lot of those all kind of trigger the OSR in my head because it all takes a lot of influence from each other. Um, Conan the Barbarian is a reference you see with a lot of stuff in the older RPGs, as an example. And even so far as like when I was working on um, Trials of the Dark Sun, I wasn't really thinking of like synth music from, you know, like Conan the Barbarian and stuff like that, that's still in that sword and sandal. I was thinking of like computer RPGs from like the 90s, like Diablo and stuff. Like I was looking at that because that was like the sound in my head at the time. I'm like, if I'm on some like dark fantasy adventure, even if it's in the desert, like this is the kind of music that's in my head.
Yeah,
Like
there's
lo-fi, fantasy music.
yeah, it's really interesting the how one influences the other, and you get that little bit of a feedback loop, right? Because almost every like the entire not just like uh fantasy adventure or those sorts of video games, almost all video games have some sort of a link back to tabletop gaming in a lot of ways. I mean, just the fact that a lot of games have health points, I think, is a direct
Mm-hmm.
direct result of tabletop gaming happening. Um, and so you can see, the influence comes in there, and then it goes in waves, where I think it cycles back, and the digital games that maybe aren't tabletop games, but are like just computer games or console games, what have you, start influencing the tabletop games. There was a long period of time where people were talking about um, the name of the game, Souls, Dark Souls, like tabletop games, and this game reminds them of that, when really I think Dark Souls drew a lot of influence from earlier editions of D&D and the deadliness of those. So it's very interesting how it really depends, I guess, on what you've experienced first, right? Like what your personal uh, entry into any of this type of genre or world of gaming, where your entrance came in, is going to be really determine where your mind goes when you're trying to equate things. So I can totally see Diablo. I mean, I played way too much Diablo when I was when I was going through college and what have you, like just way too many hours of both Diablo 1 and Diablo 2. So I can totally see when you brought that up, I just kind of had a flashback of of listening to Deckard Cain talk to me. Um, but
The moment you hear like the 12-string guitar and like
yes,
the Tristram theme, it doesn't matter. You're just like, okay, yep, this is what's going on. And that's something that like I liked about that because it's still in, I don't want to say like a super old computer game. I mean, the first one kind of is, but a lot of games at that time, it was all like very heavy MIDI instruments and stuff like that. So like having this sort of very compressed sounding, but still noticeable like facet of real instruments was another thing that captured that for me. And like I said, that was kind of what I was going for is I didn't want the music for this to sound like 8-bit. I wanted it to sound like old, not great sound quality, newer instruments, I guess, for that time period.
yeah, it's interesting how a sound, especially a music track, can really set your mind on how things are. Like for me, I remember in high school, um, when Quake first came out, and
Mm-hmm.
you had folks like Nine Inch Nails performing on it and what have you, and you're just like, this is amazing. Like it was like, the bands that I really enjoy, and you're hearing this in the video game, you're like, wow. Or I don't know how many people had, like, a little bit younger than me, but how many folks a little bit younger than me had a lot of their musical taste formed by Tony Hawk, uh, simply
Yep.
because of the music tracks that are on there. So yeah, it plays a huge part. You don't hear it as much on tabletop gaming, but I guess it's because, unlike with say a computer game or what have you, where the publisher of that game can ensure that the music is happening,
Yeah. Yep.
and has that, there's no way to make sure that's happening. So there is no like grand shared experience of sound when it comes to tabletop gaming. um I wonder if I know there are games that have come out that have kind of almost been an album based. I'm struggling to remember the name of one right now. I don't remember if Morkborg also had like an album associated to it, but
Yep.
I know there's been other games that have done that. I wonder if that will become more of a thing to build up that shared experience of the same sound happening.
I am noticing that more. So Morkborg had a companion soundtrack from the Dungeon Synth project Knoll, which is really they're like one of my favorites. It's all through the Heimat der Katastrophe label from Italy, and a couple of the other projects there's a running theory that it's all the same guy just doing different styles of dungeon synth, and it probably is. But another label on there is Kobold, and Kobold does stuff for basic fantasy. And Mazes actually had a soundtrack done by Noel as well. And this has all been within like the last few years. You start to see it more and more. I did the soundtrack for We Deal in Lead. Different third-party RPGs, whether they're it's OSR or NSR, seem to be using the idea of a soundtrack as mostly an incentive. I see it a lot for like Kickstarter and like crowdfunding. If we reach a certain goal, there'll be a soundtrack made that everyone who backed will get. And I don't know if it's the promise of free music that gets people incentivized by that, or if the idea of a soundtrack made just for a game is something that incentivizes people. That's the one thing I can't really find a definite answer on, but I'd like to hope the idea of a soundtrack is what incentivizes people.
I think it was probably partially that, and partially also the idea of it being like a collector's item, something that the general public doesn't get or something like that. Because you see a lot of that in video game spaces too, where like I'll go to buy something on Steam, and there's like, you can get this or you can get the deluxe version that comes with the soundtrack. And there's been very few games I've done that for, but there's been a couple where I've been like, yeah, this game, I feel like this is going to be a classic game for a long time. I want the soundtrack as well. So I can kind of maybe see that similar thing coming into play as in tabletop games as well. You mentioned NSR and OSR. That's actually been a whole different discussion I've been having with a few other folks. And I believe later this week, I've actually got a podcast that I'm appearing on where we're going to be talking about genres of tabletop gaming in the specifically in the old school area, and how the term OSR has kind of almost become a little bit nebulous, where it's been difficult to tie down for a long while, but especially now where it's almost unsure whether it's purely a marketing term, or is it a genre, or is it almost a nebulous label in some ways. And you've got other folks like doing NSR, or I refer to a lot of games as just indie games. Like, this is an indie game, and not a derogatory term at all, just like it's an independent game type idea. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested. So genre is big in the music world. There's I don't know if it's simply because there's more people, so it's easier to get consensus, or easier to have a critical mass of people to go, this sound is this genre. But it seems like we have a very difficult time getting that same thing happening in tabletop space, where either you can't get enough movement to say, yeah, this style of game is this text label, or if you try to say, no, that's not this text label, it's this one, there's a lot of arguments that can happen, and a lot of hurt feelings that come up where people think you're excluding them, where it's, in my view, it's a lot of it is just trying to be able to define a language so you could have a discussion about it with everybody understanding what you're talking about.
For me, I guess I look at the labels or genre terms, whatever you want to utilize them as. I look at them for like organizational purposes. I'd never seen the NSR tag until I started working with Colin when we were doing We Deal with Lead. He would tag a lot of his stuff with NSR. And that was really interesting to me because he was making a Cairn hack. And I always looked at Cairn as like an OSR, like, game set. It just seemed like that to me. So I had to like kind of dive down that rabbit hole. And I guess I'm still struggling to find the differentiations between the two. But
you and everybody else in the hobby.
But I guess when you brought up the music genre thing, it brought to mind the fact that, like, it's like saying I listen to metal.
Yes.
And saying I play tabletop RPGs. I could leave it at that, and there'd be some connection there. Oh, I also play tabletop RPGs, and if you leave it at that base level, there's not really room to argue, because you may like, 5th edition. I may like old school essentials. We can talk about our RPG experiences with both. Or we can break it down even further and say, well, I like streamlined rules, D6 based OSR sci-fi apocalyptic RPGs, much like someone would listen to polyrhythmic Polish dance metal and kind of break it down
Listen, I
like
gotta write that down because that's something. Say that again.
polyrhythmic Polish dance metal. Because why
All
not?
right, there, I'm gonna look it up. New
I'm
Spotify
sure there's
playlist.
something. I'm sure there's something out there. But the more specific you make the content you enjoy, or you refer to the content you enjoy, I think there is a bit of alienation that can come with that to people who are on the outside of that. And I don't think it's kind of problematic for both parties, because if I say I'm into like old school RPGs or OSR RPGs, I'm not saying that to throw anyone away. And my hope is that if somebody hears that, they're like, what does that mean? And I can kind of like tell them about it and get them into it. But I think some people look at that as like, well, now you're throwing an extra layer of complications on stuff. So, that must be like a you thing, and I can't be a part of that. And I think that's not a good way to look at anything. But
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance as to it on how you bring that up, because there are definitely some folks that do use it in that manner that isn't friendly or conductive to the long-term longevity of any of this. But then
mhm,
there's some folks that, like myself, for example, where I'm just trying to. The only reason I wanted to find it isn't to set, you know, rails or fences or walls. It's more just so that whenever I'm sitting down to have a conversation with somebody and I refer to something, that it's a way that the other party goes, "Oh, I know what he's talking about." Because
mhm.
if I say Pathfinder to somebody, or if I said uh, a horror movie to somebody, people would have a general idea. Oh, he's talking about horror movies. This is the type of movies that he's talking about. But if I said horror movies and I said, and then I try to refer to, um, I don't know, the new Top Gun movie that's come out, and try to say that was in that genre, people would be like, "Wait a minute, what are you saying?" and there would be a lot of confusion. And no, that's not a horror movie. But when you have that conversation in our tabletop space, I find that instead of somebody's going, "Wait, no," it's like, well, you can't say that person, like, and it just seems really odd that they can't have that discussion. So I would hope over time, and like I said, it may just simply be because there isn't enough people, where it's because it's such a niche hobby and it's so small that um, it's easy to feel like you're on the outside of it if you if you get not brought into that same label. So maybe that's the kind of the root of it. But hopefully, as it grows, that we're able to have those conversations. Because I mean, at the end of the day, all of tabletop gaming is about being able to communicate with the person across from you, right? And
Mhm.
it feels like if you can't even have that communication about the game, how are you going to have the communication in the game?
It's actually super interesting that you brought up this topic, because it just jogged my memory of last week. Um, in the Old School Essentials group on Facebook, somebody was like, I'm trying to get people to play an
I
Old
saw
School
it.
Essentials game. Yeah, and he's just like, I don't know how to word it to get people to walk away from fifth edition long enough to try it out. And a bunch of people gave him different suggestions to reword it, as it's still D&D, but high lethality, blah blah blah, this and that. And he made a reply post that it worked. He got him a bunch of players by just like rewording it. So I don't know if that's something to kind of like take as an idea of maybe, because like you said, the OSR means different things to everyone. So it's really hard to tack it down as like a way to describe it, especially when you put lots of games under that veil that are completely different from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so that's like where, you know, if you refer to something as old school gaming, old school tabletop RPGs, is that something that people might react better to than just saying, oh, it's an OSR RPG, and then trying to figure out what that means?
Yeah, there was, I believe it was Roothammer, Hankering Infernal. At one point, whenever he was first getting into old school essentials, he had a video that he had up on his YouTube site, and he was referring to it as um, I'm forgetting his exact words now, but it was something along the lines of this is traditional, or is this is the ritual that we like. He was talking about like how we roll up stats or something. He was like, this is the way it was traditionally done. We're going back and revisiting the rituals of how all this started and trying to frame it in that standpoint of like not hey, let's go play something old. It was more like, hey, let's discover how all this started. What's the foundation of it? And I thought that was an interesting approach that he took to it as well, of just trying to frame it as it's something that you're familiar with, but let's find out how it got to that point. And it'd be interesting to see if somebody took, I'm sure somebody has, but it'd be neat if somebody had a long going campaign where they started, say, in like OD&D, and every X number of sessions they changed the system they were playing and just worked their way up the D&D zeitgeist of various
That
games.
would be that would be fun to watch. I'd like to see something like that, like either in like a podcast format, or that would be fascinating because there's so much that goes into that from like a game master perspective, because you have to know like all these versions.
Yeah, you get into some of the games. I mean, I primarily play BX. That's my main game. So Old School Essentials for if you're going from an OSR perspective, but just on the various BX clones, and then mixing in that everybody has AD&D's DMG and has some familiarity with AD&D or second edition, and OD&D. A lot of those rules start to blur, and I've seen tons of people having discussions about rules and being adamant that something happens this way. And it's like, yeah, that is correct if you were playing this game, but you're talking about this one over here, so it's slightly different.
Yep.
So just being able to have somebody who can keep that straight in their head, especially if they did it on a rapid sequence, where like, all right, this week or these 2 weeks we're playing OD&D, next 2 weeks we're playing Holmes, and then we're gonna go to like it would be very difficult, but it would be very cool. I agree. I think that'd be neat. I gotta pitch that to some folks because I can't do that, but I bet you there's a few folks that I would rather play in that. I don't want to run that.
Yeah, yep. I wouldn't want to run that either.
What are you playing, or are you more of a player or a GM? Like, which end of the table do you fit?
I am the forever game master. I'm in that boat. I finally got to play for the first time a couple weeks ago to test a friend's 5th edition one shot. They're kind of taking the introductory quest, I guess, from the Curse of Strahd and trying to make it a one shot that they can have new players play.
Okay.
Because he wants to actually take it to his local like tabletop store and run it for people. And it was actually really fun. And it was like the first time I've gotten to play in a long time. And I love being a player. It's just none of my friends love being a game master. So that's usually what I have to work with. But as far as what I've been running, my group is set to play We Deal in Lead relatively soon, but besides that, we play Old School Essentials running Wayne's Dungeon Plumbers setting, which is like my favorite Old School Essentials thing I've ever gotten. I love it. The book is amazing.
Wayne's Dungeon Plumbers.
Yeah, if you look up Dungeon Plumbers, I believe his name is Wayne Roberts. If I'm wrong, I'm really, really sorry. But Dungeon Plumbers, at its basis, before you open the book, sells itself as a 1920s era diesel punk fantasy setting where the players take the role of hired mercenaries that clean out underground infrastructure of monsters and stuff.
Oh, very interesting.
That's like its base level, but if you actually go through the first like over third of the book is world building. It doesn't have to be a 1920s diesel punk thing. There's stuff in there to build a world that's sci-fi post-apocalyptic, and however you build the world can be directly like you can just take the Dungeon Plumbers rule set and throw it right into that. Because somebody was talking about an Old School Essentials post-apocalyptic setting, and I recommended that book right away. I said it's got all the world building stuff you need right on tables, and it's got all the base rules. It's got like firearms rules and medical rules and stuff like that. It doesn't have mutations or anything like that, but it has the weird system, which involves channeling magic crystals that were created by weird underground fungus and mushrooms, and there's a whole weird little like setting with that. But I also like to tell people you can play as Super Mario because you can.
As soon as you said dungeon plumbers, I gotta be honest, that's the first thing that popped in my brain.
One of the classes is literally Super Mario. You're like the de facto dungeon plumber, and you have advanced athletic movements. One of your abilities is the ability to squeeze into a pipe or a crawl space that's one size smaller than you. Different climbing. You're literally Mario, and that's gotten a lot of people interested. I'm saying, yeah, you can basically just be gritty, dark, handgun-toting Mario in this game. There's nothing stopping you.
That
When you
should
get
be the marketing slogan right there for it.
it, pretty much
dark.
is. If you look at the cover of it, the art on the front of it, if I'm not mistaken, is the art they drew for that class, which is a guy in overalls and a hat and with a mustache and a smoking gun and a pipe wrench in his hand standing on a pipe. And I'm just like, there's no way. There's no way this is in here. And everything you need to be that is in there. If you reach 9th level, instead of like forming like a guild, you form a union.
That's
like
awesome.
a plumber's. Yeah, you form a plumber's union. No, it's really good. I recommend it to almost anyone if you're trying to like spice up your old school adventure stuff and you want to do something more modern. I think it's like the de facto book for that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. I've got that on my list. I've actually got a few things on my list now that I have to look up after speaking with you. Going back to music and sound, one of the things that I've really enjoyed, especially in the podcasting space, is there's a few different solo RPG creators that are out there. The one that pops to mind immediately is a fellow Canadian. He lives not too far from me, Tale of the Manticore. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him at all, but he blends in a solo RPG actual play podcast. But he also has a musical background and works in the field as his day job, I believe, doing other items in that area, mixing and what have you. But he's brought all of his musical talents into his actual play as well, and it really, really sets the tone as you're listening to those shows that he does up. So I was going to offer as a suggestion, if you've not looked at them at all, solo RPGs, and seeing if there's any of the creators of those that would be interested in kind of pairing up the sound, because I think that's another area where you can make it to where there can be more of a shared experience and the music be part of that shared experience as well for folks. Because if you're just playing it solo, you're more likely to probably be willing to, there's less barriers to have sound and music around you at the same time. So if you haven't thought about that, that was going to be a suggestion I threw your way.
I definitely will. I'd never even thought of the concept of solo RPGs till when I got Dungeon Plumbers, because there's rules in there for playing it solo, and then working with Colin with Wheel and Lead, that's got a solo option too. And I think Rune Cairn, which is his big one he made, also has solo play rules. So that was my first exposure to that, even being a concept. I'd never even thought of that. And now that you're bringing it up, yes, that would probably be a fantastic thing to kind of start approaching, because doing a solo play with a soundtrack, I think, would be really, really interesting, especially for people who are perceiving it or watching it. It definitely would set the mood for what's going on, and you kind of know, we don't really know, but you have an idea of what's happening, so you know where to put music and how.
Yeah, exactly. I can't recommend more the Tale of the Manticore. It's fantastic. I think it's a fantastic audio experience. The gameplay is really cool, and he's able to really put out some really neat gameplay that you would almost think was scripted, but it's not. It is all legitimately played solo, and he has guests come on to do various voices and what have you. But yeah, I'd highly recommend it if you haven't listened to it. I'll have a link to his in the show notes afterwards. Another one that I would say as well that kind of falls into that similar vein, it would be James with Subclass Act as well. I almost completely blanked and didn't mention him, but he'd be another one that's in that same realm of mixing in sound with it. But see, where I've mentioned a couple of things for you to go look up. I've given you some homework. You've given me some homework. How about we give the listeners some homework? Where should people go to find you and all your works and anything that you want them to see and know about you? Where should they go?
All of my work is available on my Bandcamp, which is just bandcamp.com/ofsleepingbears, and it is all, even though it's something you're able to pay for my music, you're not entitled to, and I don't put stream limits on my songs. Some people do. You can listen to it for free 3 times, then Bandcamp will say, hey, maybe you should pay for this. I have that completely disabled because I'd rather people use my music than think they have to buy it. And for a lot of my projects, not for all of them, I do put like synopsises and examples of where the music would go in the track descriptions too.
Very good. And are you on, if people want to reach out to you and ping you, are you on Twitter or anything like that along those lines, or?
Yep, I'm on Twitter at of Sleeping Bears. That's also my handle on Instagram. You can find me there as well. That's my handle for TikTok. It's my Facebook page handle. It's pretty much all of Sleeping Bears. Usually it's lowercase, depending on what the website allows.
And my last question to you, I lie. I'll have 2 more questions. Second last question is why of Sleeping Bears? Where does the name originate from? Because folks can't see this, but I'm looking at our meat screen that I've got here. He's got a very cool icon of a bear paw, very stylized bear paw icon. But yeah, why of Sleeping Bears?
So I am from Michigan. I'm from Northeast Michigan, and if you go kind of northwest of where I live, you go to the Traverse City area, and there is a park called the Sleeping Bear Dunes, and that has a pretty strong indigenous story behind it of these 3 sort of islands that look kind of like bears, and it's like our only real major dune place in Michigan. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite places. That's part of it. The other part is bears are one of my favorite animals, so I kind of double tied it in there. That's why the bear claw is my logo. But it's mostly just an homage to where I come from, and kind of something that, regardless of what I write, I always try to keep a little bit of that with me somehow.
Well, that's very good. It's important to kind of keep true to always be able to have your own personal thing on there, even if it was a project that's completely maybe not in your normal wheelhouse. Having your own personal touch in there, I think, is important, especially for somebody who's in a creative field. So the last question I've got is, often when I do interviews with folks, afterwards I'm like, oh, I should have asked this question, or there's questions where the person who I'm having the interview with, they're probably going, oh, why? I hope he asks me about this. So my question to you is, what have I not asked you that you'd really like to talk about? What is something that, if it's super long, we can always come back for a different one. But is there something short that I should have asked that I didn't, that you'd like to let people know about or discuss at all?
I do actually. Real quick, I'm going to try to summarize it up. If this goes up in time, I am part of one of the stretch goals for Appendix N Entertainment's big Kickstarter for their old school Essentials expansion, which I will send you a link to if you maybe want to put that in the show notes.
For sure.
And we funded, but to get to a lot more of our stretch goals, we need a lot more people to kind of jump in and sort of pop in there. It's the Gateway to Adventure trilogy, and it would be really cool to be able to make a soundtrack for that, because it's not really a soundtrack for the books, because the books themselves are just class expansions. There's combat mechanics and there's magic mechanics, but all of the stuff that Ryan has written under Appendix N Entertainment takes place in the Mid Realm, which is his own sort of fantasy setting for old school essentials. and I'd be writing a soundtrack for that, which I think would be really cool because he's got a lot of fascinating stuff he's created for that would be really fun to write for.
All right, yeah. Like I said, I will be trying to get this up either tomorrow or later this week. When does the Kickstarter close? Do you know a date that it might be closing on?
I want to say October 15th.
Okay, well, we will try our very best to get this out.
Yeah.
So if you're hearing this, folks, yeah, definitely. I'll have the link to it in the show notes, and definitely go check out the Kickstarter and boost that up. And I'll take a look at it as well, and see anything with Appendix N immediately kind of catches the ear a little bit. Anyhow, so I got to take a look and see what's going on with that. Nick, I want to thank you very much for coming onto the show. It was a lot of fun chatting with you. What you do in this space is different than what a lot of other folks I speak to do. It's a lot of similarities with, I think a lot of creatives have a very similar way of approaching things and looking at things, but it's always interesting to hear how somebody else takes their art form and applies it. And I think sound is something that hopefully becomes more common in the tabletop space. Like I said, to get that shared common sound that a lot of people get from movies or video games, but I think it'd be really cool to have that in tabletop gaming as well. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on, and hopefully we can chat again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is my first ever podcast interview, so I hope I did good.
You did amazing. So
awesome. Thank you
very much. All right, folks. So yeah, please go check out all the links in the description, and I will send it back to future me, who's doing all the editing on this. Thank you very much, Nick, for joining me on the show. I will provide all the links to all the things down in the show notes. There will also be links to the Child Hero Contest. Everyone, please make sure you check that out. Also, as mentioned in the chat, don't forget to go check out that Kickstarter for Gateway to Adventure. I hope you all have been enjoying these conversations, because I definitely have, and I think they're going to become a more common thing on the podcast, even after OSR October is over. Okay, folks, that wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you're eager to come back for more. The call-in number is open at 385-2-REDCAP. That's 385-273-3227. Or you can head over to anchor.fm/theredcaps and leave a voicemail. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you so very much for listening. And remember, never let your cap dry out. Stay safe. Have fun. We'll talk again soon.